What you have is, let's back up and do the big picture first. When we talk about the elements of worship, it's important that we understand they've been prescribed by God. We don't create worship. In fact, the first commandment, we talked about the moral law of God a few minutes ago. The first commandment is what? That we're to have no other gods before God. We're not to worship anyone in addition to, above, beside anyone except God. The second commandment says that we're not to make a graven image. That is not a command that simply duplicates the first. In other words, it's not saying the same thing. It's saying something different. It's saying that I don't get to decide, and our churches don't get to decide how we're going to worship God. We can't decide the way we're going to worship Him, because when we do that, we risk idolatry. We risk, in some way, defaming God. So we follow what has historically been called the regulative principle. That is, our worship is regulated by what God has prescribed. Martin Luther and the Lutherans have said, if it's not forbidden in the Scriptures, then it's acceptable. We say no. We go by the regulative principle. Unless it is commanded in the worship of God, then it's not acceptable for us. Now, when you talk about the elements of worship, there are 7 of them. 7 prescribed things that are supposed to happen when the church gathers for worship. And all of them relate in some way to the Scripture, right? First of all, we are to read the Scripture. We are to pray the Scripture. We are to sing the Scripture. We are to teach and preach the Scripture. We are to give so that the work of the Scripture can go on here and around the world. Then there are 2 ordinances that are in addition to those 5 things, and that's baptism, which we're commanded to do, and the Lord's table. So those are the 7 prescribed elements of worship. That's why we do those things. And announcements isn't one of those. We used to include the announcements as part of the service, and I think that's acceptable. I don't think there's something wrong with that. But now we've intentionally made it so in the morning services, the announcements come first before our worship begins. And that's just to illustrate to people that everything that happens once we open with prayer, all of those things have been prescribed by God in worship. So one of those elements is music. I would encourage you, Jared, to go listen to, I did 2 messages in a series on worship, on music and worship. I don't remember the title off the top of my head, but if you have trouble finding it, you just contact me and I'll get you connected to those. But our music, why we do what we do in music, is governed by the Scripture. We have a stated philosophy of music. You can read sort of the thumbnail sketch on our website. There's a philosophy of music posted there. But when you look at how music was used, there are certain commands in the New Testament, and we look at how music was used in the Old Testament. There are some of our brothers who don't believe that some of those elements of music in the Old Testament should be today. For example, there are some who believe there should be no instruments at all, only the human voice used in worship. There are others who would prescribe certain kinds of instruments, etc. We believe, based on the Old Testament record and pattern, that it is acceptable in the worship of God to use all kinds of instruments and to have different types of music, psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, as Paul puts it in Ephesians. And so, where does special music factor in? Well, when you look at the Old Testament, you look at how the worship there was led, you'll find that there were choirs and there were instrumentalists that led. Sometimes, and you can read about it, you'll hear it in that message that I'm talking about, there's a couple of messages. Sometimes they accompanied the congregation as they sang to God. Other times it appears they were singing or leading separate from the congregation. Sometimes antiphonally, one would sing and then the other would sing, one would sing and then the other would sing. Sometimes it appears there was a separate number in which they set forth the praise of God. So we believe that special music in the church is consistent with that pattern, and that's why, as elders, we believe it's acceptable.